I never thought my own son would look me in the eye and call me a failure. At 61, I'd survived my husband's death, raised Everett alone, and taught English to 3 generations of Oregon coastal town kids. I thought I'd earned some grace. But there he was, standing in my dining room where I'd served him thousands of meals, his voice cutting through the September evening like a blade. "You failed as a mother. Mom, look at my life. Look at what you did to me." The words hung between. US like smoke from an extinguished candle. What haunted me most wasn't his anger, it was the secret I'd kept for 15 years to protect him. But how do you tell your child that you've been lying to save them from themselves? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning after Everett called me a failure, I sat in my kitchen holding my teaching journal, 30 years of observations about children, their dreams, their struggles, their small victories. The leather cover was worn smooth from countless openings, and inside, pressed between pages of lesson plans and student notes, lay dried flowers from retirement bouquets and thank you cards from graduates who'd found their voices in my classroom. Mendocino Bay stretched beyond my window, the Pacific grey and restless under October clouds. I'd moved to this cottage in 1995, the year after Ansel died, seeking something softer than the Montana ranch where I'd grown up. The cottage had good bones, built in 1962 with wide plank floors and windows that faced the water, but it was the teaching position at Mendocino Bay High that had drawn me here. 30 years old, recently widowed, with a 5-year-old son who barely remembered his father, I needed purpose beyond grief. The journal fell open to a page from 2003, Everett. Hold, sophomore year. Brilliant mind, but carries something heavy. Reminds me of his father, charm, masking uncertainty. Must watch for signs of self-sabotage. I'd written that about my own son during his 2nd year at the high school where I taught. Even then, I'd noticed the way he performed perfection while fear flickered behind his eyes. My phone buzzed against the kitchen counter. Moira's name lit the screen, and I almost let it go to voicemail. My best friend and neighbour had been calling since last night, probably having heard about the dinner disaster through the town's official gossip network. Mendocino Bay was the kind of place where arguments carried on ocean breezes, where secrets lasted about as long as morning fog. Reverie, Moira's voice was gentle but firm. "I'm coming over. I'm fine. No, you're not. And neither sitting alone with whatever poison Everett poured into your ears." I looked at my reflection in the kitchen window, sultan pepper hair that had finally gone completely grey, eyes the same blue-green as the sea I'd stared at for nearly 3 decades. 61 years old, and I felt ancient. He wasn't entirely wrong, about what? That you're a failure as a mother, the woman who worked 2 jobs to send him to Stanford, who drove 4 hours every weekend to watch his college debate tournaments, who lied to him for 15 years about the most important thing that ever happened to him. Silence stretched between us, filled only by the sound of waves against the rocks below my house. Moira knew what I meant. She'd been the only one I'd told the truth to, the only witness to the choice I'd made when Everett was 16. "You protected him," she said finally. "Did I? Or did I protect myself from having to face what kind of mother I really was?" 20 minutes later, Moira knocked on my door carrying a thermos of coffee and the no-nonsense expression she wore when tending wounded customers at her flower shop. At 62, she was 3 months older than me and liked to remind me of this fact whenever I tried to pull rank. Her grey hair was cut in a practical bob that moved like water when she shook her head, which she did often when discussing the general foolishness of the world. "Show me," she said, settling into the chair across from my kitchen table. I knew what she meant. The police report was still where I kept it for 15 years in my bedroom closet, inside a shoebox that also contained Ansel's death certificate, Everett's baby teeth, and a photo of the 3 of us from happier times. But I wasn't ready to face that piece of paper yet, not when Everett's words from last night still echoed in my mind. Instead, I pulled out my phone and showed her the text message that had started it all. 3 weeks ago, out of nowhere, family dinner Sunday. "Rowan, and I have something to tell you. Bring the good china." "I should have known," I said. The good china was code for bad news. Moira read the message twice, her expression darkening. What did they tell you? That their marriage was over. That Rowan was taking Nina and moving to Portland. That it was somehow my fault for not preparing Everett for real life. I made air quotes around the phrase, still feeling the sting of how he'd delivered it. He said I'd coddled him, made him weak, taught him to run away from problems instead of facing them. And you believed him. I believe the part about running away from problems. God knows I taught him that by example. Moira set down her coffee, cup with more force than necessary. Reverie Holt, I have known you for 28 years. You are many things: stubborn, overly protective, prone to keeping secrets that would be better shared, but you are not a coward. And you are certainly not a failure as a mother. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to sink into the comfort of her friendship and let her convince me that Everett's anger was misplaced, that his marriage had failed for reasons that had nothing to do with how I'd raised him, but the weight of the secret I'd carried, pressed against my chest like a stone. There's something you don't know about that night when he was 16, I said quietly. Something I never told you. Moira leaned forward, her hands clasped around her coffee cup. What do you mean? I didn't tell you everything about what happened. About what Everett did. The afternoon light was shifting, turning the kitchen golden as I tried to find words for something I'd buried so deep I'd almost convinced myself it wasn't true. Outside, I could hear the sound of children playing on the beach below, probably tourists staying at the bed and breakfast down the coast. Their laughter felt like an accusation. He was drinking, I said finally. That night he crashed Ansell's truck. But it wasn't just drinking. Moira waited, understanding that some stories needed space to unfold. There was a girl with him, Sarah Martinez, a junior from his class. She was ... I stopped. The words caught somewhere between my throat and my conscience. She was unconscious when they found her, and there were indications that something had happened before the crash. The silence that followed felt heavy as storm clouds. Moira's expression didn't change, but I saw something shift behind her eyes, a recognition of why I'd carried this burden alone for so long. What kind of indications? She asked carefully. Her clothes were torn, there were marks on her wrists, and when she came to at the hospital, she didn't remember anything from after they left the party. The doctor said it could have been the head injury, but ... I trailed off, unable to finish the sentence even after all these years. What did Everett say happened? That he didn't know. That she'd been drinking too. That they'd made out a little at the party. That she fell asleep in the truck on the way home. He swore nothing else happened. That the marks must have been from the crash. I rubbed my temples, feeling the familiar headache that came with this memory. The police weren't sure what to believe. Sarah couldn't remember, and there was no physical evidence that would hold up in court. But they were ready to investigate further, maybe press charges, and you stopped them. I convinced them it would traumatize Sarah more to drag it through the legal system when she couldn't even remember what happened. I convinced her parents that pursuing it would only hurt their daughter. And I convinced myself that Everett was telling the truth. I looked up at Moira, seeing my own doubt reflected in her face. But what if he wasn't? What if I helped my son cover up something terrible because I couldn't face the possibility that I'd raised someone capable of it? Moira was quiet for a long time, staring out at the ocean where afternoon light was beginning to fade into evening. When she finally spoke, her voice was measured, careful. What happened to Sarah? Her family moved away that summer. She transferred to a school in Sacramento, graduated early, went to college somewhere in Colorado. I tried to keep track of her for a few years, but ... I shrugged helplessly. Eventually, I stopped looking. I told myself she was better off without reminders, and Everett went to Stanford on the scholarship I helped him get by keeping this quiet. Graduated summa cum laude, met Rowan in grad school, built what looked like a perfect life. I laughed bitterly. Except it wasn't perfect, was it? And now he's blaming me for everything that's wrong with him, including the very thing I sacrificed. My conscience to protect him from facing. The kitchen was growing dark around us, and I reached over to turn on the lamp that sat on my counter. The warm light made everything look softer, more forgiving. But I knew it was an illusion. Some things couldn't be softened by Kinder lighting. He doesn't know, Moira said. It wasn't a question. I never told him how close he came to criminal charges. Never told him about Sarah's injuries or her memory loss. I let him believe it was just a drunk driving accident that we all agreed to handle quietly. I closed my teaching journal, running my fingers over the warm leather. I thought I was protecting him. But maybe I was just protecting myself from having to see who he really was. Or maybe, Moira said gently, you were protecting this scared 16-year-old boy who made a terrible mistake and has been running from it ever since without even knowing what he's running from. I looked at her, this friend who'd stood by me through Ansel's death, through Everett's difficult teenage years, through my retirement, and all the quiet moments in between. She had a way of seeing hope where I saw only shadows, possibility where I saw only failure. What if I tell him the truth now? I asked. What if I explain what really happened that night, what I did to protect him, and he hates me even more? What if you don't tell him, and he spends the rest of his life blaming you for problems he doesn't even understand? Outside, the children's voices had faded, replaced by the eternal conversation between waves and shore. I thought about Everett as a little boy, how he used to collect shells on this same beach, building elaborate castles in the sand while I graded papers nearby. He'd been such a gentle child then, careful with smaller kids, protective of injured animals, always quick to apologize when he thought he'd done something wrong. Where had that little boy gone? When had he become the man who could look his mother in the eye and call her failure? And how much of that transformation was my fault for letting him grow up with secrets he didn't even know existed? The oak dining table where everything fell apart had been in my family for 3 generations. My grandmother brought it west from Iowa in 1943. My mother polished it every Sunday after church, and I'd serve Thanksgiving dinner on it for 35 years. The wood held memories in its grain homework sessions when Everett was small, birthday celebrations, quiet dinners after Ansel died when conversation felt too heavy for just 2 people. That Sunday evening in September, I'd set it with my good china as requested, the spode pattern with tiny blue flowers that Ansel and I had received as a wedding gift. The late afternoon light slanted through my dining room windows, painting everything golden, and I'd convinced myself that whatever Everett and Rowan needed to tell me, the beautiful setting would somehow soften it. They arrived at 6, Everett in the khakis and button-down shirt he wore to his job at the environmental consulting firm, Rowan in a flowing dress that had always looked bohemian for my practical son's taste. 10-year-old Nina bounced in wearing a paint-stained smock, her dark hair escaping from its ponytail in the way that reminded me of her mother. Grandma Rev, Nina launched herself at me with the kind of enthusiasm that made my 61-year-old bones feel younger. I brought you a drawing of the tide pools we found yesterday. She pulled a folded paper from her pocket, a surprisingly detailed sketch of sea anemones and starfish in purple and orange crayon. Nina had inherited her mother's artistic eye and her father's attention to detail, a combination that produced more masterpieces I proudly displayed on my refrigerator. It's beautiful, sweetheart. Did you see any hermit crabs? 3? And Mama said we might come back next weekend to look for more. She glanced up at her parents, and I caught something uncertain in her expression, as if she wasn't sure about next weekend anymore. Rowan bent to kiss my cheek, her usual greeting, but there was tension in her shoulders that I hadn't seen since the early days of her marriage, when she'd been trying so hard to fit into Everett's idea of what a wife should be. Thank you for having us, she said quietly. Everett nodded in my direction, not quite cold, but distant in the way he perfected over the past few years. Since his job had become more demanding and his marriage had grown strained, family dinners had felt more like obligations than celebrations. But I kept inviting them anyway, hoping that familiar rituals might bridge whatever gaps had opened between us. I made your favorite, I told him, gesturing toward the kitchen where part roast was staying warm in the oven. And Nina, there's apple crisp for dessert, with ice cream. Is there any other way to serve apple crisp? Nina grinned and skipped toward the kitchen, but Everett caught her arm gently. Let's sit down first, sweetheart. Your mom and I need to talk to Grandma about something important. The word important hung in the air like a warning bell. I'd been a teacher long enough to recognize the tone adults used when they were about to deliver news that would change everything. Nina seemed to sense it too, because her bouncing energy settled into something more cautious. We took our usual seats around the table, Everett at the head, where Ansel used to sit, Rowan to his right, Nina across from her, Emmy at the far end where I could serve easily. The arrangement had evolved naturally over the years, but suddenly it felt formal, like we were positioning ourselves for a negotiation rather than a family meal. So, I said, smoothing my napkin across my lap, what's this important news, Everett? And Rowan exchanged a look that confirmed my growing unease. It was the kind of glance that carried entire conversations: resignation from her, determination from him, and underneath it all, the exhaustion of two people who'd been fighting the same battle for too long. Rowan and I getting divorced, Everett said. No preamble, no gentle lead-in, just the statement delivered like a business announcement. Nina's foot clattered against her plate. I reached for my water glass to give my hands something to do while my mind processed what I'd heard. Divorced. The word felt foreign in connection with my son, who'd planned his wedding with the same methodical attention he brought to everything else. I'm sorry to hear that, I said carefully. Are you sure there isn't a way to work things out? Marriage counseling, maybe, or we try counseling, Rowan said quietly. For almost 2 years, but some problems can't be fixed with talking. Everett's jaw tightened. What Rowan means is that some people aren't willing to do the work required to fix problems. The criticism was subtle but unmistakable, and I saw Rowan flinch. This was familiar territory for them, the dynamic I'd watched develop over the 10 years of their marriage. Everett, always pushing for solutions, for action, for measurable progress. Rowan, increasingly withdrawn, artistic, content, to let things exist in their messy, unresolved state. It's not about unwillingness, Rowan said, her voice steady despite the emotion underneath. It's about accepting that some people just aren't compatible in the ways that matter. We were compatible enough to get married and have a child. We were young enough to mistake attraction for compatibility. Nina had stopped eating entirely, her eyes moving between her parents like she was watching a tennis match she didn't understand. I wanted to redirect the conversation, to protect her from witnessing this dissolution in real time. But I also sensed that this had been rehearsed, that they'd agreed to tell me together, as a united front, even as their unity was crumbling. What? About Nina, I asked. I'm moving to Portland, Rowan said. There's a gallery there that's offered me a position, and it's a better environment for Nina's schooling. More diverse, more opportunities, and I'll have her on weekends and holidays, Everett added quickly. It's not like I'm abandoning my responsibilities as a father, but something in his tone suggested he felt abandoned himself. I'd seen this before with my students, children of divorce who blamed themselves for their parents' failures, who carried guilt that wasn't theirs to bear. Except Everett wasn't a child anymore. He was 35, a grown man with his own career and life choices, and yet he was looking at me with the same wounded expression he'd worn as a teenager when things didn't go according to his plans. When? I asked. Next month, Rowan said. I know it's sudden, but the gallery position starts in November, and Nina should be settled before the school year gets too far along, next month. I looked at my granddaughter, this bright, curious girl, who would soon be 2 hours away instead of 20 minutes, who would grow up shuttling between homes, spending holidays on schedules determined by lawyers rather than love. I'm sorry, I said again, because I couldn't think of anything else to offer. I know this must be incredibly difficult for all of you. It is, Rowan agreed, but staying together would be more difficult. For everyone. She looked pointedly at Everett when she said this, and I caught a flash of something darker in their exchange, not just incompatibility, but genuine hurt. Whatever had broken between them went deeper than the surface-level differences they were presenting to me. I don't understand, Nina said suddenly, her voice small but clear. Why can't you just try harder to like each other? It was such a child's question, so innocent and logical, that it stopped the adult conversation completely. Rowan reached over to stroke her daughter's hair, and for a moment, the careful composure she'd maintained all evening cracked just enough to show the pain underneath. Sometimes, sweetheart, trying harder doesn't fix what's broken, she said gently. Sometimes people love each other but can't live together happily. But Grandma Rev loved Grandpa Ansel, and they lived together happily. I felt my chest tighten. Nina had never known her grandfather. He died years before she was born, but she'd grown up hearing stories about our marriage, carefully curated tales of romance and partnership that glossed over the harder truths. The drinking that had started after Everett was born, the silences that had stretched for days. The way Ansel had retreated into himself, whenever life became too complicated to solve with charm and good intentions. Your grandmother and grandfather had their own challenges, Everett said, and there was something sharp in his voice that made me look at him more closely. Not every marriage is the fairy tale it appears to be, Everett started, but he continued. In fact, I'm starting to think that most marriages fail because people have unrealistic expectations based on stories that aren't entirely true. The criticism was directed at me now, though I wasn't sure why. Yes, I'd shared happy memories of Ansel with my family, but wasn't that what grandmothers were supposed to do? Preserve the good parts of family history for the next generation. What's that supposed to mean? I asked. It means that maybe if you'd been more honest about what marriage actually looks like, the work it requires, the compromises you have to make, maybe I would have been better prepared for reality. The words hit me like cold water. You're blaming me for your divorce. I'm saying that you raised me to believe that love was supposed to be easy, that good people who care about each other can make anything work if they just try hard enough. But that's not true, is it? Sometimes people hurt each other even when they love each other. Sometimes the trying just makes everything worse. Rowan was staring at her plate now, refusing to meet anyone's eyes, and I realized this wasn't the first time they'd had this conversation. This wasn't just about their marriage failing, it was about Everett needing someone to blame for the failure. And I was the most convenient target. I never told you marriage was easy, I said carefully. Your father and I had our difficulties. Did you? Because all I remember hearing were stories about how perfect you two were together, how you understood each other completely, how he was your best friend and soulmate. Everett's voice was getting louder, and Nina was shrinking into her chair. Maybe if you told me the truth about your marriage, about Dad's drinking, about the fights you thought I couldn't hear, about the way he left you to raise me alone. Even before he died, maybe I would have known what I was signing up for. The accusation hung between us like smoke. Part of me wanted to defend the choices I'd made, to explain that protecting a child from adult problems wasn't the same as lying. But another part of me recognized the pain behind his anger. He was right that I'd kept secrets, right that I'd shaped his understanding of love and marriage through selective storytelling, but he was also hurting his daughter in his need to hurt me, and that I couldn't allow. Nina, I said gently, why don't you go watch TV in the living room while the grown-ups finish talking? She looked grateful for the escape, sliding down from her chair and disappearing around the corner. I waited until I heard the television turn on before continuing. You're right that I didn't tell you everything about your father, I said quietly. I thought I was protecting you from pain you were too young to understand. If that was wrong, I'm sorry. It wasn't just wrong, Mum. It was damaging. Do you know what it's like to grow up believing you come from this perfect love story and then discover that love doesn't actually solve everything? That sometimes it's not even enough. Rowan finally looked up, and I saw tears in her eyes. Everett, please no, she needs to hear this. He turned back to me, and in his face I saw the 16-year-old boy who used to rage against his homework, against curfews, against any limitation that didn't fit his vision of how the world should work. You failed me, Mum, as a mother, as a teacher, as a guide to what adult life actually looks like. You gave me a fantasy instead of preparation, and now I'm 35 years old realizing I don't know how to be married to someone who isn't perfect, how to love someone who can't be fixed, how to stay when things get hard. The words you failed me echoed in the dining room that had hosted so many family celebrations. I felt them settle into my chest like stones, heavy and immovable. Around us, the good china suddenly looked fragile, too delicate for the weight of this conversation. I did the best I could, I said. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't enough. Not for him, not anymore. Your best wasn't good enough. His voice was quieter now, but no less devastating. And now my marriage is over. My daughter is going to grow up in a broken home. And I have no idea how to be the kind of man who can fix any of it. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "Come on, Rowan, let's get Nina home, Everett." Waiter started to rise, but he was already calling for his daughter. "We're leaving, sweetheart. Say goodbye to Grandma." Nina appeared in the doorway, looking confused and sad. She came over to hug me, and I held her tighter than usual, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo and trying to memorize the weight of her small body against mine. "I love you, Grandma Rev," she whispered. "I love you too, Nina, so very much." Rowan hugged me last, and in that embrace I felt an apology she couldn't speak aloud. "I'm sorry," she murmured against my ear. "He's just ... he's in so much pain right now. Take care of yourself," I whispered back. "And take care of her." Then they were gone, leaving me alone in my dining room with the good china and the part roast growing cold in the oven. I sat back down at the table where 3 generations of my family had shared meals, where I'd planned lessons and graded papers. And worried about Everett's future, the late September light was fading outside my windows, and in the growing darkness, I could see my reflection in the glass, an older woman sitting alone, surrounded by the remnants of a family dinner that had gone terribly wrong. "You failed me, Mom." The words wouldn't leave me alone. I gathered the plates, scraped food into the garbage, loaded the dishwasher with mechanical precision while my mind replayed every moment of the conversation. Had I really damaged my son by protecting him from painful truths? Had my stories about Ansel created unrealistic expectations that made it impossible for Everett to accept imperfection in his own marriage? Or was this just the inevitable result of choices I'd made long ago, choices that had protected him from consequences he should have faced, that had taught him someone would always be there to smooth over the rough edges of his mistakes? As I washed the good china by hand, being careful not to chip the delicate blue flowers, I thought about the secret I'd kept for 15 years. The police report in my bedroom closet, the choice I'd made to protect Everett from the full weight of what happened that night when he was 16. Maybe Rowan was right that some things couldn't be fixed with talking. But maybe some things couldn't be healed until the talking finally happened. The morning after the dinner disaster, I couldn't bring myself to leave the house. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with photo albums spread before me like evidence. In a trial I was conducting against myself. 36 years of motherhood reduced to carefully arranged snapshots, each one a small fiction designed to preserve happiness rather than document truth. Here was Everett at age 5, gap-toothed and grinning on his first day of school. I'd been so proud that morning, watching him march up the steps of Mendocino Bay Elementary with his Spider-Man backpack and his chin held high. What the photo didn't show was the 2 hours I'd spent talking him down from a meltdown the night before because his shoelaces weren't perfectly even, or the way I had to bribe him with extra stories just to get him to sleep. Here he was at 8, holding up a participation trophy from Little League. He'd hated baseball, hated the unpredictability of the game, the way other kids could hit the ball effortlessly while he struck out despite hours of practice in our backyard. But Ansel had insisted, said it would teach him to be tougher, more resilient. So I'd driven him to every game and cheered for every swing while watching him shrink a little more each time he failed to live up to his father's expectations. And here was the photo that made my chest ache. Everett at 16, standing beside Ansel's restored pickup truck on the day he got his license. He was trying to look casual, one hand resting on the hood, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he held himself like he was afraid the moment might slip away if he relaxed. 3 weeks later, that truck would be wrapped around a tree on Highway 1, and everything would change. The photo albums had been my way of curating our family story, selecting moments that supported the narrative I wanted to remember. But as I turned through page after page of birthdays and holidays and ordinary Sundays, I began to see what I'd left out. The fights between Ansel and me that Everett had witnessed. The nights when Ansel came home too drunk to help with homework or bedtime stories. The way my son had learned to read the weather of adult moods and adjust his behavior accordingly. I thought I was protecting him from the messiness of grown-up problems. But maybe what I'd actually been doing was teaching him that real feelings were something to be hidden, that authentic relationship meant pretending everything was fine even when it wasn't. My phone rang, interrupting my archaeological dig through family memories. Moira's name appeared on the screen, and I let it go to voicemail. I wasn't ready to talk about last night, wasn't ready to hear her gentle insistence that Everett's anger would pass, that families survive worse storms than this. But 20 minutes later, she was knocking on my door anyway, carrying a bag of groceries and wearing the expression she reserved for emergencies at the flower shop. "You're not answering your phone," she said, pushing past me into the kitchen. I was busy. She glanced at the photo album scattered across my table and nodded like this confirmed a diagnosis. Right, the self-flagellation portion of the program. I wondered when we'd get to that. I'm not self-flagellating. I'm trying to understand where I went wrong by looking at baby pictures. By looking at the story I told myself about who we were as a family. I picked up the little league photo and held it out to her. Look at his face. He's miserable, but I kept taking him anyway because Ansel said it was good for him. How many times did I do that? How many times did I choose what looked right over what felt right? Moira set down her grocery bag and took the photo from my hands. She studied it for a long moment, and I could see her mental file cabinet opening, pulling up memories of Everett's childhood that she'd witnessed from her position as honorary aunt. He was 8 years old, she said finally. 8-year-olds are miserable about lots of things that are actually good for them: vegetables, bedtimes, homework. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. This was different. He begged me to quit, and I made him finish the season anyway, because that's what parents do. They teach their children that commitments matter, that you don't give up just because something is hard, or because I was afraid of disappointing Ansel. And it was easier to sacrifice Everett's happiness than deal with my husband's criticism. Moira sat down across from me, pushing aside a photo album to make space for her elbows. Reverie, you cannot rewrite your entire history as a mother based on one terrible conversation. Yes, you made mistakes. Every parent makes mistakes. But that doesn't erase 35 years of love and sacrifice and showing up for your son, doesn't it? If the end result is a man who calls his mother a failure and blames her for his inability to stay married, the end result is a man who's in pain and looking for someone to blame because accepting responsibility for his own choices is too scary. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to sink into the comfort of her friendship and let her convince me that this would pass, that Everett would apologize, and we'd find our way back to something resembling normal. But the weight of 15 years of secret keeping pressed against my ribs like a physical ache. "There's something else," I said quietly. "Something I should have told him years ago." Moira's expression shifted from sympathetic to alert. About his father, about him, about something that happened when he was 16. After the accident, I took a deep breath, tasting salt air and my own fear. "I think it's time you knew the whole truth." For the next hour, I told her everything. About the party Everett had attended the night he crashed Ansel's truck. About Sarah Martinez, unconscious and injured in ways that suggested more than just a car accident. About the police investigation that had been quietly dropped after I convinced everyone involved that pursuing it would cause more harm than good. Moira listened without interrupting, her face growing more troubled as the story unfolded. When I finished, she sat in silence for a long time, staring out at the ocean where afternoon fog was beginning to roll in from the horizon. "Jesus, Reverie," she said finally. 15 years. You've been carrying this for 15 years. I didn't know what else to do. He was 16, a good kid who'd made a terrible mistake. The girl couldn't remember what happened, and pursuing charges would have destroyed both their futures. What if it wasn't a mistake? What if he double quotes? She couldn't finish the sentence, but I heard the question anyway. "I don't know," I admitted. "That's the horrible truth. I don't know what my son did that night, and I was too afraid to find out. And now he's 35 years old. His marriage is falling apart, and he's blaming me for not teaching him how to face hard truths. The irony is so thick I can barely breathe through it." Moira reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. Her fingers were stained with flower dye and soil, evidence of a life spent nurturing things that grew in the light instead of festering in darkness. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I don't know." "Tell him, maybe. finally face what I should have faced 15 years ago. That could destroy your relationship with him completely. Our relationship is already destroyed. At least this way, it would be destroyed by truth instead of lies. We sat together as the fog thickened outside my windows, turning the familiar landscape into something ghostly and uncertain. I thought about Everett as a little boy, the way he used to climb into my lap during storms and ask me to tell him stories about brave princesses and clever knights who always found ways to save the day. When had I stopped being the person who could save him? When had I become the person he needed saving from? My phone buzzed against the table. A text message from Rowan. Thank you for dinner. I'm sorry about how the evening ended. He's struggling more than he wants to admit. I showed the message to Moira, who read it twice before handing the phone back. She's trying to build a bridge, she said, or apologize for watching her husband tear down his mother. Maybe both. I typed back. How is Nina handling the news? The response came quickly, better than the adults. She asked if you could take her tide pooling next weekend before we move. My throat tightened. Next weekend might be the last time I'd see my granddaughter for months, maybe longer. Portland was only 2 hours away, but divorce had a way of complicating even simple geography. Custody schedules and loyalty conflicts could turn short distances into insurmountable chasms. Tell her yes, I typed. I'd love to spend time with her. Thank you. She adores you, you know. Whatever else is happening, please don't doubt that. I set the phone down and looked at Moira, who had been reading the exchange over my shoulder. She's giving me permission to love my granddaughter, even though her father has written me off. Or she's reminding you that not everything is broken. That some relationships can survive truth-telling. That evening, after Moira had gone home and I'd put away the photo albums, I sat in my living room with the box I'd retrieved from my bedroom closet. The police report was at the bottom, underneath baby teeth and report cards and a dried corsage from Everett Senior Prom. The paper had yellowed slightly with age, but the words were still clear, still capable of changing everything I thought I knew about that night 15 years ago. Incident report. Motor vehicle accident with possible sexual assault. Reporting. Officer, Detective Maria Santos. Date, October 15, 2006. I'd read it so many times over the years that I'd memorized whole sections. The description of the accident scene, the condition of the vehicle, the injuries sustained by both passengers, and then, in clinical language that somehow made it worse, female passenger found unconscious with torn clothing and ligature marks on wrists. No memory of events preceding accident. Male passenger claims no knowledge of female's injuries beyond those sustained in crash. There were witness statements from the party that attended. Kids who remembered seeing Everett and Sarah together, drinking and laughing and disappearing upstairs for a while before leaving together around midnight. But teenage memories were unreliable, colored by alcohol and loyalty and the universal tendency to protect friends from consequences that seemed too severe for ordinary teenage mistakes. The medical report was more damning. Sarah had been treated for a concussion, 3 broken ribs, and lacerations that were consistent with sexual assault. But she'd also been severely intoxicated, and head injuries could cause memory loss that made prosecution nearly impossible. The district attorney had been willing to proceed, but when I convinced Sarah's parents that a trial would re-traumatize their daughter and likely end in acquittal anyway, they'd agreed to let it go. Everyone had agreed to let it go. Everyone except Sarah, who'd left town 3 months later and never returned. I closed the file and leaned back in my chair, listening to the sound of waves against the rocks below my house. 15 years ago, I'd made a choice to protect my son from consequences I believed would destroy his future. Tonight, I had to decide whether to protect him from the truth of what I'd done to help him escape those consequences. The woman who'd raised him on stories of heroic characters who always did the right thing in the end would tell him everything. But the mother who'd spent 15 years living with the weight of an unforgivable choice wasn't sure she had that kind of courage. Outside, foghorns sounded their warnings to ships navigating dangerous waters in the dark. I understood the metaphor. Was probably too obvious. But sometimes the most important truths were the ones hiding in plain sight. The weekend with Nina came faster than I'd expected. each day blurring into the next as I wrestled with whether to tell Everett the truth about what I'd hidden for 15 years. Friday afternoon found me walking the beach below my house, searching for the perfect tide pools to show my granddaughter perhaps the last ones we'd explored together before her new life in Portland began. The Oregon coast in October was brutal and beautiful, all grey skies and wild wind that tasted of salt and possibility. I'd walked this stretch of beach countless times over the decades, through my marriage to Ansel, through his death, through all the small and large moments that had shaped my understanding of what it meant to love someone imperfectly. Today, the familiarity felt like comfort and accusation in equal measure. Rowan dropped Nina off Saturday morning, pulling into my driveway in the old Honda that had seen better decades. My granddaughter tumbled out wearing rain boots and the serious expression she wore when approaching important expeditions. At 10, she had already developed the kind of focused curiosity that reminded me of myself at that age, the need to understand how things worked, why they were the way they were, what lay beneath the surface of ordinary appearances. Grandma. Rev, I brought my nature journal, she announced, holding up a composition book covered in her own drawings of sea creatures. Mama said I should document everything so I don't forget when we move. The casual mention of forgetting hit me harder than I'd expected. Of course, she was worrying about forgetting she was 10 years old, and 2 hours might as well be 2,000 miles when you're that small. I bent down to hug her, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo and trying to memorize the weight of her arms around my neck. We won't let you forget, I promised. And Portland isn't that far away. We'll find ways to visit. But even as I said it, I wondered if it was true. Divorce had a way of redrawing family maps, turning simple relationships into complicated negotiations. If Everett continued to blame me for his failures, would he want Nina to maintain a relationship with the grandmother who had supposedly damaged him so profoundly? We spent the morning exploring the tide pools near Devil's Punch Bowl. Nina crouched beside shallow pools of seawater, while I pointed out the various creatures that called these rocky spaces home. She sketched hermit crabs and sea anemones with the same careful attention I'd once brought to lesson planning, asking questions that revealed a mind already learning to think like a scientist. Why do the anemones close up when you touch them? She asked, gently prodding one with her finger and watching it retract into a green blob. They're protecting themselves, I explained. They can't tell the difference between a gentle touch and something that might hurt them, so they respond to everything as if it might be dangerous. That seems sad, Nina said, settling back on her heels, being so scared that you can't tell when someone's trying to be nice. I looked at her, this perceptive child who had inherited more than just her mother's artistic abilities, and felt the familiar ache that came with loving someone you might lose. Sometimes when people have been hurt before, they forget how to trust gentle touches, I said carefully. Is that why Daddy gets so angry sometimes? Because he's scared. The question caught me off guard. Nina was 10, old enough to sense undercurrents, but young enough to ask about them directly. I wondered how much she'd overheard of her parents' fights, how much she'd absorbed of the tension that had been building in their house for months. What do you think? I asked, using the teacher's trick of answering a question with a question. I think he's sad about something he won't talk about, she said matter-of-factly. And when people are sad but pretend they're not, it comes out as mad instead. The observation was so accurate it made my throat tight. This child had been watching her father with the kind of careful attention I'd once brought to troubled students, learning to read the weather of adult emotions and adjust her behavior accordingly. Just like Everett had done as a boy, just like I'd done with my own father decades ago. You're very wise, I told her. Mama says I'm too wise for my own good sometimes. Nina dipped her finger into another tide pool, watching the water ripple outward in concentric circles. She says I'm worrying about grown-up stuff that isn't my job to worrying about. Your mama's right. It's not your job to fix the grown-ups in your life. But what if they can't fix themselves? The question hung between us like morning fog, heavy with implications I wasn't sure a 10-year-old should be carrying. I thought about Everett at her age, the way he'd tried to mediate between Ansel and me during the worst periods of our marriage, taking on responsibilities that should never have been his burden. Then they have to learn how, I said finally. And sometimes that takes longer than we'd like. We continued our exploration, moving from pool to pool as the tide receded and revealed new treasures. Nina filled several pages of her journal with sketches and observations, her concentration so complete that I found myself studying her profile and looking for traces of the family that had shaped her. She had Everett's serious expression when focused, Rowan's delicate features, and something entirely her own in the way she approached the world with curiosity instead of caution. Around noon, we took a break on a piece of driftwood that had been polished smooth by decades of waves. Nina pulled sandwiches from her backpack, peanut, butter and jelly cut into perfect triangles the way her mother always made them, and we ate, while watching seabirds dive for fish in the deeper water beyond the tide pools. Grandma, Rev, Nina said between bites, "Are you sad that we're moving?" The directness of the question shouldn't have surprised me. Nina had always been the kind of child who asked what adults were thinking instead of guessing, but I felt tears prick the corners of my eyes anyway. "Yes," I said honestly, "I'm very sad. I'm going to miss spending time with you. Will you miss Daddy too?" I considered lying, offering some gentle fiction about how families sometimes go through difficult periods but love each other through everything. But Nina was too smart for comfortable lies, and she deserved better than the kind of protective storytelling that had apparently damaged her father so profoundly. "I'm sad that your daddy and I aren't getting along right now," I said carefully. "But that doesn't change how much I love him, or how proud I am of him, or how much I want him to be happy." He said, "You failed him." The words hit me like cold spray from a rogue wave. I'd hoped Everett wouldn't share his anger with Nina, wouldn't burden her with adult conflicts she couldn't understand or resolve. But of course, she'd heard something. Children always heard more than adults thought they did. "Yes," I said. "He feels like I made mistakes when I was raising him, and maybe I did. Parents aren't perfect, and sometimes we make choices that seem right at the time but cause problems later." "What kind of mistakes?" I looked out at the ocean, where waves were building as the afternoon wind picked up. "How do you explain to a 10-year-old that you kept secrets that maybe should have been shared, that you protected someone from consequences they should have faced, that you spent 15 years wondering if it helped your child avoid responsibility for something unforgivable?" "I tried to protect him from some hard truths when he was growing up," I said finally. "I thought I was helping him, but maybe I was just making it harder for him to learn how to deal with difficult things." "Like what?" "Like the fact that his father struggled with drinking. And that sometimes when people love each other, they still hurt each other. And that growing up means learning how to face problems instead of avoiding them." Nina nodded thoughtfully, as if this confirmed something she'd already suspected. "Mama says the truth is usually better than pretending, even when it hurts. Mama is very smart. Are you going to tell Daddy the truth now?" The question was so simple, so logical, that it took my breath away. Out of the mouths of babes, as they said. Here was my 10-year-old granddaughter, cutting through 15 years of rationalization and fear with the kind of clarity that only came from not yet learning that some truths were too dangerous to speak. "I'm thinking about it," I said. "Good," Nina said, finishing her sandwich and brushing crumbs from her jacket. "Secrets make people sick sometimes. Like when you eat too much candy and your stomach hurts, except it's your heart that hurts instead." We spent the rest of the afternoon exploring further down the beach, Nina collecting shells and interrupting rocks while I tried to process her inadvertent wisdom. By the time Rowan came to pick her up, my granddaughter had filled half her journal with observations, and I'd filled my mind with the growing certainty that she was right. Secrets did make people sick, and I'd been carrying this particular sickness for far too long. Rowan arrived as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with this coastline 30 years ago. She looked tired, the kind of exhaustion that came from managing logistics and emotions in equal measure. But she smiled when Nina ran to show her the treasures from our expedition. "Look, Mama." Grandma Rev found a whole sand dollar, and we saw a sea otter, and I drew 17 different kinds of creatures. Rowan examined each sketch with the kind of attention that made Nina glow with pride, asking questions about technique and observation that revealed her own artistic training. Watching them together, I felt the familiar pang of regret that this Marriage was ending, that Nina would grow up shuttling between parents instead of enjoying the stability of a united family. But I also saw something I'd missed during the years when I'd been so focused on what appeared to be wrong with Everett's marriage. The genuine affection between mother and daughter, the easy communication, the way Rowan encouraged Nina's curiosity instead of trying to contain it. Maybe some divorces weren't failures so much as recognitions that some relationships worked better when they stopped trying to be something they weren't meant to be. Thank you, Rowan said quietly as Nina packed up her journal and art supplies. She needed this, we both did. How are you doing with everything? Rowan glanced toward her daughter, who was saying goodbye to a hermit crab she'd named Harold. Then back to me, better than I expected, actually. Scared, but also relieved. Does that make sense? It makes perfect sense. Sometimes the hardest thing about leaving is admitting how much you needed to go. Everett doesn't see it that way. Everett has a hard time seeing anything that doesn't fit his idea of how things should be. Rowan nodded, understanding passing between us that didn't need to be articulated. We'd both loved a man who was brilliant and driven and fundamentally unable to accept that some problems couldn't be solved through effort and determination alone. He's not a bad person, she said. And I heard the guilt underneath the words, the universal tendency of women to apologize for setting boundaries, even when those boundaries were necessary for survival. No, I agreed. He's not bad. He's just damaged in ways he doesn't understand yet, and angry about it. Very angry. Nina bounced back over to us, her cheeks pink from salt air and excitement. Grandma Rev, will you send me pictures of the tide pools after we move? So I can remember how they look in different seasons. Of course, sweetheart. And maybe you can send me pictures of the new places you discover in Portland. It's a deal, she said solemnly, extending her small hand for me to shake as they drove away, Nina waving from the passenger window until they disappeared around the curve that led back to town. I stood in my driveway and felt the weight of approaching darkness. Not just the literal sunset, but the sense that something was ending this phase of my relationship with my granddaughter, this version of our family that had limped along despite its fundamental brokenness, this comfortable delusion that I could keep painful truths buried indefinitely. That night, I sat in my living room with the police report spread across my coffee table, reading it again by lamplight while rain drummed against my windows. 15 years ago, I'd convinced myself that protecting Everett from the consequences of his actions was an act of love. But looking at it now, through the lens of Nina's simple wisdom about secrets making people sick, I began to wonder if what I'd really been protecting was my own image of myself as a good mother. Good mothers didn't raise sons who might sexually assault unconscious girls. Good mothers didn't have to choose between justice and family loyalty. Good mothers found ways to solve problems without compromising their moral center. But maybe the real failure wasn't in the choice I'd made 15 years ago. Maybe it was in the choice I'd been making every day since to let that moment define us both. To let fear of the truth poison every interaction we'd had since then. Nina was right. Secrets made people sick, and we'd all been sick for far too long. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October, 3 weeks after Nina and Rowan had moved to Portland. I'd been checking my mailbox religiously, hoping for postcards from my granddaughter describing her new adventures. So when I saw the unfamiliar return addresses, Martinez, Sacramento, CA, my first thought was that someone had sent me something by mistake. It wasn't until I was back in my kitchen, coffee growing cold as I stared at the envelope, that the name clicked into place. Sarah Martinez, the girl who'd been in the truck with Everett 15 years ago. The girl whose unconscious body had been found beside my son in the wreckage of Ansel's pickup. The girl whose family had moved away 3 months after the accident, and who I'd convinced myself was better off never looking back. My hands shook as I opened the envelope, half expecting some kind of legal document, a belated attempt to seek justice for something I'd helped cover up. Instead, I found a handwritten letter on simple stationery, the kind of careful cursive that suggested someone who'd taken time to compose their thoughts. Dear Mrs. Holt, I hope this letter finds you well. I realize it's been 15 years since we last spoke, and you probably never expected to hear from me again. I certainly never planned to write to you, But some things have a way of circling back, whether we want them to or not. I've been living in Sacramento since I graduated college, working as a victim's advocate for the district attorney's office. It's ironic, I suppose, helping other people navigate a justice system that I never got to experience myself. For a long time, I was grateful for that. The idea of testifying about something I couldn't remember, of having my trauma dissected in front of strangers, seemed like more punishment than I could bear. But lately, I've been wondering if avoiding that confrontation was actually what kept me sick for so long. Because I was sick, Mrs. Holt, for years after the accident, I struggled with anxiety, depression, and a kind of persistent fear that I couldn't name or understand. I had nightmares about things I couldn't remember, panic attacks triggered by smells and sounds that seemed to come from nowhere. It wasn't until I started therapy in my mid-20s that I began to understand how trauma can live in the body, even when the mind refuses to acknowledge it. My therapist helped me see that forgetting isn't the same as healing, and that sometimes the things we can't remember are the very things we most need to face. 3 years ago, I began the process of trying to recover those lost hours from the night of the accident. Through EMDR therapy and careful work with specialists who understand memory and trauma, some pieces have started to come back. Not everything may be never everything, but enough to know that your son didn't just give me a ride home that night. Enough to know that the injuries I sustained weren't all from the car accident. Enough to know that you knew this when you convinced my parents not to pursue charges. The letter slipped from my hands and fluttered to the kitchen floor. I stared at it lying there, the neat handwriting, suddenly looking like evidence in a trial I'd been hoping would never come. My coffee had gone completely cold, but I couldn't seem to move to reheat it, couldn't seem to do anything but sit frozen in the chair where I'd received this unexpected reckoning. After several minutes, I bent to retrieve the letter, my 61-year-old niece protesting the movement. There was more 3 pages total, and part of me wanted to stop reading, to tear it up and pretend it had never arrived. But Nina's voice echoed in my memory. Secrets make people sick sometimes. And I'd been sick for 15 years. I want you to know that I'm not writing this letter to threaten you or to demand some kind of justice that's no longer possible to achieve. The statute of limitations ran out long ago, and even if it hadn't, I understand why you made the choice you did. You were protecting your son the way any mother would. I might have done the same thing in your position, but I also want you to know that your protection came at a cost not just to me, but to Everett as well. Because the thing about secrets, Mrs. Holt, is that they don't just disappear when we refuse to acknowledge them. They live inside us, shaping how we see ourselves and how we move through the world, even when we can't consciously remember why. I've spent the last few years learning to live with the truth of what happened to me that night. It's been difficult, but it's also been liberating in ways I never expected. For the first time since I was 17, I feel like I'm inhabiting my own life instead of running from it. I'm writing to you because I think your son deserves the same opportunity. I don't know what kind of man Everett has become, or whether he even remembers what he did that night. Trauma affects everyone differently, and it's possible that alcohol and guilt have buried those memories as deeply for him as they were buried for me. But I do know that carrying the weight of unacknowledged actions can be just as damaging as carrying the weight of unacknowledged wounds. A few weeks ago, I saw an announcement in the Sacramento Bee that caught my attention. Everett Holt's name appeared in a list of recent divorces, and something about seeing it in print made me realize that I wasn't done with this story yet. I hired a private investigator to find out more about his life, not to stalk him or cause him harm, but to understand what kind of person he'd become. What I learned surprised me. By all accounts, your son is a good man. He works for an environmental consulting firm, volunteers with a literacy program, and by everyone's description is a devoted father. He's also, according to people who know him well, someone who struggles with intimacy, who has difficulty trusting his own instincts, who seems to be searching for something he can't quite name. Mrs. Holt, I think what he's searching for is the truth about who he was that night, and who he's been every day since. I'm not suggesting that you tell him about this letter. That decision is entirely yours to make. But I'm suggesting that 15 years of protecting him from the consequences of his actions might have done more harm than good, not just to me, but to him as well. Some wounds can only heal when they're brought into the light. I hope you'll consider whether it might finally be time to let that happen. Sincerely, Sarah Martinez Pess. I've enclosed a photo of myself from last month. I wanted you to see that I'm okay, truly okay. Maybe for the first time since I was 17. I hope that knowledge brings you some peace, even if this letter brings you everything else. I looked at the photograph she'd enclosed. A woman, in her early 30s with dark hair and kind eyes, standing beside a Sacramento County District Attorney's office sign. She was smiling, not the bright, forced smile of someone pretending to be happy, but the quiet, steady smile of someone who'd fought their way through darkness and found genuine light on the other side. She was beautiful, and she was alive, and she was telling me that the choice I'd made to protect my son had prevented both of them from healing. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, reading and rereading the letter, while rain began to fall outside my windows. Sarah's words had the ring of truth that comes from years of careful self-examination, the kind of clarity that only emerges when someone stops running from painful realities and turns to face them instead. Some wounds can only heal when they're brought into the light. The phrase echoed in my mind as I thought about Everett's anger, his failed marriage, his apparent inability to accept imperfection in himself or others. What if Sarah was right? What if the protective choice I'd made when he was 16 had trapped him in a prison of unacknowledged guilt and unexamined shame? What if everything that was wrong with his life could be traced back to that October night in 2006 and the decision I'd made to bury the truth instead of helping him face it? I thought about the dinner 3 weeks ago, the way he'd called me a failure as a mother while standing in the dining room where I'd spent countless evenings helping him with homework. The way he'd blamed me for not preparing him for the realities of adult life, for giving him fantasy instead of truth. He'd been right, but not in the way he thought. I hadn't given him fantasy about marriage and love. I'd given him fantasy about himself. I'd let him believe that the worst thing he'd ever done was get drunk and crash his father's truck, when the truth was so much more complicated and devastating. The irony was suffocating. He'd accused me of failing to teach him how to face hard truths, and all along I'd been sitting on the hardest truth of all. That afternoon, I called Moira and asked her to come over. When she saw the letter spread across my kitchen table, her face went pale. "How did she find you?" she asked after reading it twice. "It doesn't matter how. What matters is that she's right." I gestured toward the pages covered in Sarah's careful handwriting. "Look at what she's become, a victim's advocate. Someone who helps other people find justice and healing. While my son is 35 years old, divorced, and blaming everyone else for his problems, you don't know that this is connected. Don't." Moira, think about it. When did Everett start having trouble with relationships? When did he start seeming like he was running from something he couldn't name? It all started after that night. Moira was quiet for a long time, studying Sarah's photograph with the expression she wore when examining particularly delicate flowers. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to tell him everything, the police report, what Sarah remembered, what I did to protect him from consequences he should have faced. Reverie, this could destroy your relationship with him forever. Our relationship is already destroyed. At least this way, it'll be destroyed by truth instead of lies. And if he can't handle the truth, if it breaks something in him that can't be fixed," I looked out at the ocean, where storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. "Then maybe he'll finally understand what I've been carrying for 15 years. And maybe we can figure out how to heal together instead of suffering alone." That night, I sat down at my computer and began typing an email to my son. I'd tried calling first, but it went straight to voicemail, and this wasn't the kind of conversation you could have in a 2-minute message anyway. The email took me 3 hours to write, and when I finished, it was the longest piece of honest communication I'd shared with Everett since he was a child. Subject: something I should have told you long ago, Everett. I received a letter today that has forced me to face some choices I made 15 years ago, choices that I thought were protecting you, but which may have been protecting me instead. I need to tell you some things about the night you crashed your father's truck. Things I kept from you because I thought you were too young to handle them, and then kept from you because I was too afraid of what they might mean. I'm attaching a copy of the police report from that night. as well as a letter I received today. From Sarah Martinez. I think it's time you knew the truth about what happened, about what I did to protect you from facing it, and about the cost of that protection for both of you. I know this will be shocking and painful. I know you may never. Forgive me for keeping this from you, or for the choice I made to prioritize your future over her justice. But I've come to believe that secrets cause more damage than truth, even when that truth is difficult to bear. If you want to talk about this to rage at me, to ask questions, to try to understand how we got here, I'm ready for that conversation. If you never want to speak to me again, I'll understand that too. But I couldn't carry this alone for another day. I love you, and I'm sorry. Momi attached the police report in Sarah's letter, then sat staring at the screen for another hour before finally clicking send. The email disappeared into the digital ether, carrying with it 15 years of carefully guarded secrets and the last remnants of the relationship I'd spent my entire adult life trying to protect. Outside, the storm that had been building all day finally arrived, bringing with it the kind of wind and rain that reminded you how small you were in the face of forces beyond your control. I listened to it rage against my windows while I waited for my phone to ring, for my computer to chime with a response, for some sign that my son had received the truth I'd finally found the courage to share. But the night passed in silence, and when morning came, there was only the sound of waves washing the beach clean, preparing it for whatever came next. The silence that followed my email stretched into days, then a week, then 2 weeks. October bled into November with no word from Everett, and I began to understand that some truths created chasms that couldn't be breached with time or hope or even love. I'd expected anger, accusations, demands for explanation on anything, but this complete radio silence that felt like erasure. On a grey Tuesday morning, 2 weeks after I'd sent the email that changed everything, my phone rang. Not Everett's number, but one I didn't recognize with a Portland area code. For a moment, my heart lifted with the possibility that it might be Nina, calling from some new phone to tell me about her adventures in the city. Instead, I heard an unfamiliar male voice. Professional but kind. Mrs. Holt, this is Dean Lasker. I'm a journalist with the Portland Tribune, and also a former student of yours from Mendocino Bay High. I graduated in 2003. The name clicked into place after a moment. Dean Lasker, quiet kid, brilliant writer, had gone on to study journalism at UC Berkeley. He'd been in my advanced placement English class, one of those students who'd made teaching feel like a calling rather than just a job. Dean, of course, how wonderful to hear from you. How are you doing? I'm doing well, thank you. Actually, I'm calling because I'm working on a series of articles about influential educators on the Oregon coast, and your name came up several times when I was interviewing people about teachers who'd made a lasting impact. I was wondering if you might be willing to talk with me, maybe do a feature interview about your years in education. The request caught me completely off guard. After 2 weeks of feeling like a pariah in my own family, the idea that someone might want to celebrate my career rather than condemn my choices seemed almost surreal. I don't know if I'm the right person for that kind of feature, I said. I'm retired now, and honestly, I'm not sure I was as influential as people might remember. Mrs. Holt, I've talked to dozens of your former students over the past few months, and I can promise you that you were more influential than you know. The stories people tell about your classes, about how you help them find their voices and believe in their own abilities, it's remarkable, despite everything that had happened. In recent weeks, I felt tears prick the corners of my eyes. Teaching had been the one thing I'd always felt confident about, the one role where I'd known I was making a positive difference in the world. To hear that confidence validated by someone whose judgment I respected was a gift I hadn't known I needed. I suppose I could talk with you, I said. When were you thinking? Would this weekend work? I could drive down from Portland on Saturday. I know it's a bit of a trip, but I'd love to see Mendocino Bay again, and I think the interview would be more meaningful if we could do it in the place where you spent your career. Saturday. That gave me for days to prepare, to figure out how to talk about 30 years of teaching without mentioning the ways my personal life had imploded in recent weeks. For days to remember who I'd been before I became the mother who'd kept devastating secrets, the woman who'd prioritized protection over truth. Saturday works, I said. Should we meet at the school? Actually, I was hoping we could meet somewhere more personal. Maybe your home, if you're comfortable with that. I find that people are more open when they're in familiar surroundings, so we arranged for him to come to my cottage at 2 o'clock on Saturday afternoon. After I hung up, I spent the rest of the week cleaning house with an intensity that probably bordered on manic. I told myself it was just normal preparation for a guest. But really, it was a way to channel the nervous energy that had been building since I'd sent that email to Everett. By Friday evening, my cottage sparkled like something from a home magazine. Every surface gleamed, every book was properly shelved, every photo was dusted and straightened. I'd even bought fresh flowers from Moira's shop, white roses and eucalyptus branches that filled the living room with the kind of gentle elegance I hoped might make me seem like the kind of person worthy of a feature article. Moira had dropped off the flowers herself, taking one look around my spotless house and shaking her head. "You know he's coming to interview you about teaching, not to inspect your baseboards," she said. "I want everything to be perfect. Why? You're already perfect. You spent 30 years molding young minds and helping kids discover who they were meant to become. That's not something that gets erased by dust on a coffee table. But perfection felt important right now, necessary in a way I couldn't fully explain. If I couldn't be the perfect mother and recent events had made it clear that ship had sailed, maybe I could at least be the perfect retired teacher, the kind of person who deserved to be remembered fondly rather than avoided. Saturday morning. Dawn clear and cold, the kind of November day that made the Oregon coast look like a postcard. I spent the morning baking Dean's favourite cookie snickerdoodles, which I remember from the batch his mother had sent to share with the class during our Christmas party his senior year. It was a small detail, but I'd always believed that small details were what made people feel seen and valued. At exactly 2 o'clock, a silver Honda pulled into my driveway, and I watched from my kitchen window as Dean climbed out. He'd filled out since high school, trading the lanky awkwardness of 18 for the confident bearing of a man in his early 40s. His dark hair was shorter now, professionally styled, and he carried himself with the kind of purposeful energy that suggested someone who'd found his calling and was good at it. I opened the door before he could knock, greeting him with a smile. I'd perfected over 3 decades of welcoming nervous students into my classroom. "Dean, look at you, so grown up and professional." Come in," he smiled back, and I caught a glimpse of the shy teenager he'd been underneath the polished exterior. "Mrs. Holt, you look exactly the same." Seriously, it's like stepping back in time. I knew it wasn't true. The past few weeks had added new lines around my eyes and a greyness to my complexion that no amount of concealer could hide, but I appreciated the kindness anyway. "Can I get you some coffee? Or tea? I made snickerdoodles. I remember they were your favorite." His face lit up with genuine delight. "You remember that, after all these years?" I remember everything about my students. It was part of the job. We settled in my living room with coffee and cookies, the afternoon light streaming through my windows and painting everything golden. Dean pulled out a small recording device and a notebook, but before he turned anything on, he looked around the room with the expression of someone revisiting a meaningful place. "I have to tell you, Mrs. Holt, this feels a little surreal. I've been thinking about you and your class a lot lately, especially as I've been working on this education series. You were one of those teachers who changed everything for me." "How so?" "You were the first adult who made me feel like my thoughts mattered, like what I had to say was worth listening to." "Do you remember the essay I wrote about my parents' divorce?" I did remember a raw, honest piece about watching his family fall apart and feeling powerless to stop it. He'd been 17, dealing with adult emotions he didn't have the tools to process, and writing had become his way of making sense of the chaos. "You wrote about feeling like you were translating between 2 languages that used to be the same," I said. "It was beautiful and heartbreaking." Dean's eyes widened. "I can't believe you remember the details." "Like I said, I remember everything. That essay was the first time you let yourself write with complete honesty instead of trying to write what you thought I wanted to hear. It was a breakthrough moment, it was. And the note you wrote in the margin, 'Your truth is your strength, and sharing it is your gift to the world.' I still have that paper. I've carried those words with me through college, through my career, through every difficult story I've had to write. The conversation continued like that for the next hour. Dean asking questions about my teaching philosophy, while I found myself remembering why I'd loved this work so much. We talked about the evolution of education, about the challenges facing teachers today, about the particular magic that happened when you help young people discover their own voices. You know, Dean said, pausing to turn over a new page in his notebook. One of the things that came up repeatedly when I was interviewing your former students was how you created space for difficult conversations. People mentioned that your classroom felt like a safe place to explore complicated emotions and moral questions. Something in his tone had shifted, become more careful, more purposeful. I felt a familiar prickle of unease, the same sensation I used to get when a student was building up to a question they weren't sure they should ask. That was always important to me, I said carefully. Literature is full of moral complexity, and I thought students needed to grapple with that complexity in order to understand both the books they were reading and the world they were living in. Were there ever times when that became challenging? When students brought up situations that went beyond literary analysis into real-world ethical dilemmas. The question hung in the air between us, and I realized this interview had just shifted into different territory. Dean wasn't just here to write a fluff piece about a beloved retired teacher. He was investigating something specific, and that something probably had to do with my family. Dean, I said slowly, what exactly are you working on? He had the grace to look uncomfortable. I'm sorry, Mrs. Holt. I should have been more upfront from the beginning. Yes, I'm working on a series about influential educators, and yes, your name came up in that context. But I'm also following up on some information that came to my attention about an incident that occurred in 2006, involving a student named Sarah Martinez and your son Everett. The room seemed to contract around me. Of course, someone would eventually dig into this story, would connect the dots that I'd thought were safely buried. I should have known that secrets this big couldn't stay hidden forever, especially in a small community where everyone knew everyone else's business. I see, I said, proud of how steady my voice sounded. And what exactly do you think you know about that incident? I know that there was a car accident involving two teenagers, that one of them was seriously injured, and that what should have been a straightforward drunk driving case was quietly handled without charges being filed. I know that Sarah Martinez's family left town shortly afterward, and that the incident was never reported in the local media. A lot of things don't get reported in the local media. Dean, that doesn't necessarily mean there was a cover-up. No, but it means there are questions worth asking, especially when one of the people involved has spent their entire adult life working in social justice advocacy, and the other has recently gone through a very public and contentious divorce. My heart was racing now, but I forced myself to remain calm. What are you really asking me? Dean leaned forward slightly, his expression earnest but determined. I'm asking if you'd like the opportunity to tell your side of the story, because with or without your input, I'm going to write about what happened that night. The question is whether you want to be part of that conversation or let other people define the narrative. It was a journalist's ultimatum, delivered with the kind of professional courtesy that didn't disguise its essential threat. Talk to me now, or watch me write this story without your perspective. But as I sat there looking at this man who'd once been my student, who'd learned about the power of truth-telling in my classroom, I realized that maybe this was exactly what needed to happen. Maybe the reckoning I'd been dreading was also the salvation I'd been seeking without knowing it. If I tell you what really happened, I said quietly, will you let me tell all of it? Not just the parts that make for good headlines, but the whole complicated truth. That's all I've ever wanted to write, Dean said, the whole complicated truth. I looked around my living room at the books that had shaped my understanding of human nature, at the photos that told the story of my family in carefully curated moments, at the flowers Moira had brought to make everything beautiful. Then I looked back at Dean, this former student who'd grown up to make truth-telling his profession, and made the decision that had been building in me for 15 years. All right, I said. Let me tell you about the worst choice I ever made, and why I'm finally ready to face the consequences. Dean turned on his recording device and opened his notebook to a fresh page. I'm listening. It began with a headline, former high school teacher breaks silence about 2006 scandal involving son, now divorced father and community advocate article. Went live the following Sunday, printed above the fold in the Portland Tribune, and within 24 hours, it had been shared, reposted, debated, and dissected on every social media platform that allowed comment threads to grow like wildfire. The story wasn't sensationalized. Dean had kept his word. He told the truth as I had told it to him, messy and nuanced. He didn't glorify or vilify. He didn't paint me as a tragic mother or a villainous conspirator. He let my words stand beside the police report and Sarah's letter, and then he stepped back. And still, the world reacted like it always does when the past refuses to stay buried. Parents from my former school emailed the district demanding my teaching record be reviewed. Old students, some supportive, some stunned, shared their memories of my classroom. Everett's name became a search engine suggestion overnight. The environmental firm where he worked posted a vague statement about internal conversations and respecting privacy. Rowan called to say someone had left a letter at their Portland gallery calling her an enabler. But the worst fallout came when Everett finally responded. His email came 2 days after the article went live. No subject line, just a single paragraph. You had 15 years to tell me the truth, and you waited until the world could read it before I did. You didn't protect me, you protected yourself. I don't know if I can ever forgive that. I reread those words dozens of times, searching for hope in their subtext, some crack in the armor that suggested the beginning of healing. But there was nothing, only distance and fury, and the kind of cold finality that once ended a friendship I'd had. Since childhood, I thought of not responding, then I thought of Nina. Instead, I wrote, "You're right. I protected myself from what you'd think of me, from what I'd have to admit about myself as a mother. I don't expect your forgiveness, but I still believe you deserve the truth. I hope one day you'll want to speak to me again. Until then, I will still love you, and I will always be here." He didn't reply. A month later, Rowan texted me from Portland. "Nina wants to see you. She says you're the only one who still takes her tide pulling seriously. So I drove north the following weekend. I packed peanut butter sandwiches and her old nature journal and a new pair of waterproof boots, just in case the November tides came in fast." Rowan met me at a corner cafe near their new apartment, and she looked thinner than I remembered, as if the stress of parenting and public attention had etched new hollows beneath her eyes. "She knows a little," Rowan said before Nina arrived. "We told her you told a hard truth. She knows Everett is angry. But she also knows that you're not the enemy. I'm not sure even I know what I am anymore." Rowan touched my hand briefly. "You're still her grandmother, and I still trust you." Nina barreled in moments later, all wine 10 gold hair and oversized coat, and she flung herself into my arms like I hadn't broken the fragile web that held her family together. "Grandma Rev," she cried, "I missed you. Can we go look for sea glass today too?" So we did. We walked until our faces were red from the cold, until the wind tugged at our scarves and sea spray kissed our cheeks. Nina told me about her new school, about the library with beanbags instead of desks, about the girl who'd drawn a jellyfish so real it made her blink. And then, just as we were packing up, she asked, "Why is Daddy so mad?" I froze. She didn't ask it with malice, only with the painful, honest curiosity that children are born with, the kind adults lose from too much fear. I crouched down beside her and said, "Because sometimes telling the truth makes people remember things they don't want to. And when we hurt inside, we sometimes get mad at the people who love us most." She looked at me for a long time. "Will he stop being mad someday?" "I hope so, sweetheart. I really, really hope so." 6 months later, time passed like it always does, with no regard for the slow healing of human hearts. Everett never responded to my follow-up emails. His company put him on administrative leave. Nina's school began asking more questions about her home life. And still, life marched on. But then something unexpected happened. Sarah Martinez reached out. This time, it wasn't a letter, it was a phone call. "I thought you should know," she said, "that Everett emailed me." My throat went dry. "What did he say?" "He didn't apologize, not directly. But he said he read my letter, that he remembered more than he'd admitted. That he'd spent the last 6 months unraveling the person he thought he was. I didn't know what to say. He said he wasn't ready to talk to you. But he started therapy. He asked me to recommend someone. I wept. Not because it solved anything, not because it absolved me, but because, finally, there was a crack in the wall. 1 year later, Everett knocked on my door. He looked tired, like he hadn't slept much in months. But there was a softness around his eyes I hadn't seen in years. I don't know what I want to say, he said, standing in my doorway. That's okay, I said. You showed up. He came inside. He didn't ask for tea. He didn't want to sit down. He just stood in the center of my living room, the same place where I'd once bandaged his skinned knees and taught him to recite poetry. I remember more, he said. About that night, I waited. I don't think I forced her, but I didn't make sure she was okay either. I didn't stop to ask. I didn't care enough to know. His voice cracked. And now ... I don't know how to live with that. I stepped forward, slowly, and put my arms around him. You start by facing it, I said. And you don't do it alone. He didn't hug me back, not right away. But he didn't pull away either. And that was enough. 2 years later, the article was nominated for a state journalism award. Dean called to tell me in the spring, his voice breathless with excitement. They want you to come speak at the ceremony. Tell your side of the story, what truth-telling cost. What it gave back. I told him I'd think about it. That night, Everett called. Do you want company? He asked. I think Nina would like to hear you speak. I think I would too. I couldn't answer for a moment. When I finally did, my voice shook. I'd like that very much. Truth doesn't heal everything. Some relationships never go back to what they were. Some wounds never fully close, but secrets, they rot from the inside. They eat away at everything good. And sometimes, letting them go doesn't make you whole again, but it makes you honest. And in the quiet aftermath of wreckage, sometimes that's enough. Up next, we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.